Secretary of State Marco Rubio announcing this week that the U.S. will begin aggressively revoking visas for Chinese students, including those with connections to the Chinese Communist Party. The State Department saying it won't tolerate what it calls the exploitation of American schools. So how serious is this threat? Former State Department official Christian Whiton with me now. Christian, great to see you. Let's start with that simple question. Is this really a serious threat to the United States, having, I think it's something in the region of 250,000 Chinese students here?
Exactly, Jonathan. Yeah, of the approximately 1 million foreign students, a quarter of them the Chinese. The threat is twofold. One is outright espionage, whether they enter the United States with the intent of stealing information and giving it to Chinese companies or government agencies, or whether they are just pressured and recruited. It's a recent case out of Stanford where that happened with a Chinese student who was posing as a student, recruiting and pressuring students. But then there's just the other issue of princelings of members of the Chinese Communist Party who are let into our universities, who pay full freight, who displace American students, and whether or not that's really fair. Does Harvard with a $50 billion endowment or Yale with a $40 billion endowment really need to be teaching foreign students from our chief adversary in the world and displacing Americans?
So, Christian, this all, I guess, began with the Nixon era in the 1970s and the rapprochement that we had with China then. And it was sort of a use of soft diplomacy, in a sense, having these Chinese students here. Numbers exploded, obviously, during the 80s and 90s. But we are, those who say that's a good thing, the answer to that is, I guess, we're living in a very different world in terms of China now.
That's right, and if you believe in Nixon realism and realpolitik, what he was doing in reaching out to China was attempting to separate it from the Soviet Union. You know, we were in the process of losing the Vietnam War. We were in economic crisis with the Arab oil embargo. The communists seemed to be doing pretty well in the Cold War, and it was a real coup to split China apart and expose those fissures within communism. But Nixon, I think, today would want that to be reevaluated. He would say today, oh, China is the main adversary. Frankly, ought to try a rapprochement with Russia. But the idea also that these students are going to come here and breathe the sweet air of freedom and go back to China and spread democracy just hasn't panned out, partly because American universities, especially the ones, the elite ones that these guys can pay to go to school at, are pretty anti-American.
Now, what about those students, Christian, who could indeed bring something of value to the United States and to colleges here? I mean, it's very easy to say we're going to keep out anybody with ties to the Communist Party in China. I mean, it's hard to grow up in China without being given some nebulous tie to the Chinese Communist Party. Every kid's going to be taken along to a Communist Party rally, for instance. So how do you sort, for want of a better phrase, the wheat from the chaff here?
Right. It's very hard to do. Of course, there's a lot of dishonesty. If you can pay the, 80 grand, in some cases even more, for some of these elite expensive schools, then probably you do have some sort of in. It's very hard to rise to that level in business with China without having some connection with government. So I think it goes back to the question, and this also comes up with H1-B visas. Silicon Valley says, oh, we have to bring in all these foreigners. We can't get Americans to fill these jobs. And in fact, they just want to work people 70 hours a week for a lot less than you'd have to pay an American. China is our chief adversary in the world. We can have a debate over whether there are too many Indians or too many Brits at schools and filling these visa slots. But when it comes to our chief adversary in the world, China, the number really should be pretty close to zero, unless there's some small cases where it's really in America's national security to let a certain individual in, son of a dissident, something like that.
So you would support going down to zero Chinese students?
Yes, that's right. Well, you know, if China wants to deal, the president just announced they're really not negotiating in earnest on trade. They have people like Jimmy Lai still locked up in prison. They took away his pro-democracy newspaper, obliterated his public company. You know, if they want to throw us a bone, if they want to negotiate in earnest, then we can negotiate in earnest about that. But I think, as with so many things, since the Chinese don't seem to be serious or taking us seriously about our security concerns, then zero on student visas and zero on H1-Bs ought to be at least our opening negotiating point.
And Christian, just quickly, you're as a former worker within the State Department, I wonder what you make of Marco Rubio's promises to completely revamp the way the State Department works. Long overdue or too much?
Now, it's long overdue, and paradoxically, it'll make the department more powerful. There's so many bureaus, so many people, and it's like a faculty. It's shared powerlessness. If you do what they just did at the National Security Council, reduce the number of people and reduce the scope, it'll actually make the people who are there better at diplomacy, more effective, and more people will listen to what they say.
Christian, it is always great to see you. I feel we always learn a lot in our 3 minutes or so with you. Thank you so much, Christian Whiton.
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate it.